this episode of the podcast, I'm speaking to Lisetta Lovett. She's a medical lecturer, conference speaker, and the author of a new book about Casanova called Casanova's Guide to Medicine. So we should get to see what medicine was like at the time of Casanova's life, and also the different ailments that he treated himself for, which should be interesting. Please like and subscribe, and watch till the end of the conversation to see more conversations in the links provided.
I was born in London. My mother was Italian, father English, and did a degree in Mathematics and Physiology at London University, and then went into medicine. And I studied medicine at Guy's Hospital. I got very interested in psychiatry, and because I was, quote, a mature student, which seems risible now, but we're all, I was just 3 years older than anyone else. Yeah. I thought, well, maybe that I needed to get on with psychiatry. But during my 5 years at Guy's, I was allowed to take a year out. Most people went off and did a Bachelor's of Science or Arts, but I had my BSc. So I just took a year out, and in that year, I did a history of medicine course, which the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries ran and still runs, and I obtained a diploma in history of medicine as a result. Okay. And I spent the year doing life drawing and Italian during that year.
Okay. Italy seems to be a reoccurring theme for you then, really.
Yes, it is. It is. The book I've just written about Casanova does have a whole chapter about the relationship between doctors and patients and the role of ethics and medical etiquette.
This book.
That's it. Thank you. You've got my book. How nice.
I have. I've got it. Yeah, it's a beautiful book. It's beautifully designed and written and everything as well. I'm working my way through it at the moment, but it's gorgeous to look at, isn't it?
I think the publishers have done me proud on that. The artist who did that really made it look special.
Yeah, definitely. So what brought you to Casanova then? Obviously you've got a medical background, so yes. You've got a kind of theme of Italy popping up here again, but why did you choose, and I think you use the words on your website, you're looking through the medical of the 18th century through the lens of Casanova, or through his eyes. So why Casanova in particular did you choose?
Well, it's just chance, actually, because I was, when I retired, I went off to Malawi for a month to as a voluntary lecturer, and lectured medical students for about 4 weeks. There's not a lot to do in the evenings in Malawi. So my husband, he was a historian before he went into medicine, said to me, well, you should read these memoirs. They're really quite fun and interesting, and there's a lot of medicine in them. So I got them, I downloaded them on my Kindle, my wonderful Kindle, and that's what I did. And I thought, wow, this is really interesting. And then I thought, well, surely somebody's written about the medical aspects that he talks about, because the memoirs are a hugely important and useful resource of the culture and the social sort of attitudes and behaviour of the time, and have been written about, but not medicine, it would appear. I found one book which was written by an Italian neurologist, very slim book, and that's actually why I went back to Italian classes, because I couldn't understand it. So I thought, no, I've got to get my Italian back to a reasonable level. So I thought, right, well, this will be an interesting project, and I just started to harvest all the medical details, any reference to health, illness, whatever. And because they are 12 volumes, it's a long...
Sorry to interrupt. I was just going to say about the 12 volumes, that must have taken forever. It's vast. I've got the set of, the autobiography book, and it's like more than a foot.
Yeah.
It's a huge amount of work to do that.
Yeah. Well, it did take me about 18 months, 2 years to do that properly. Wow. Okay. But then there was the issue of how do I organize this material? How do I make it interesting to other people? Because I was very keen that although it should be an academic piece of work, in other words, well referenced, I also wanted to make it accessible to the general curious reader. So that was a challenge, which was why it's taken quite a few years to complete the book.
Yeah, I can imagine it's a huge amount of work. Just flicking through your book, it's very dense in information as well. I can see that it's spectacularly researched. So thanks for doing that, because it saves me looking through the entire autobiography at those things, because there's several times throughout your book as well, and it does come up when you're reading Casanova's work again, this constant, the medicine keeps coming back and coming back, his love sort of medicine as well. He seemed to be passionate about that. Well, he seemed to be passionate about everything really, which is what makes him appealing, but people seem to rely on his advice for medicine quite a bit as well, don't they? They sort of trust his opinion, whether that's because he's a bit of a huckster or he knows what he's talking about, I'm not sure. But the first thing that you kind of mentioned in the book is about is Bettina and the smallpox. I think for those people who don't know, Bettina, I think, was his first love. So if you could explain kind of what happened there, because it's actually it shows you his character as well, that situation, doesn't it?
Yes. Bettina was the younger sister of his teacher. He was living in Padua with his teacher because he'd been sent there by his mother because he had been quite a sickly child, and his mother had taken advice from a well-known Professor Macopi, who suggested that he have a change of air. So that's how he ended up in that environment. And Bettina developed smallpox at some point. And the whole story is quite long and complicated, so I'll try and simplify it. But sticking with the smallpox, she was very badly affected by smallpox. It took her about a year to get through it and recover. And of course, she was quite disfigured by it during the more acute episode. I don't think people realize today how unpleasant smallpox was. The mortality rate was very high, but more importantly, the morbidity rate was high, and it would be very unusual for people not to have signs of smallpox. Gozzi, her brother, sent all the other boarders in his house away so that they wouldn't get it. And Casanova looked after her. And what's particularly touching is he stopped her scratching herself, because obviously the scabs were very itchy. And he would do that by appealing to her vanity and saying, nobody's going to marry you, Bettina, if you scratch yourself. Your skin will look awful. And that did the trick. Which I always think is very funny. I mean, he was 2 years younger than Bettina. At this time, he must have been about 13 or so. Anyway, she practiced inoculation. She said, look, let me give you some of the pus from my scab into an open wound site. So that was actually inoculation. And it's quite interesting that youngsters that age seem to know about this. But then, of course, it was Padua, very near Venice. Venice was in the middle of trade routes from the east. And it was common practice in Turkey, inoculation. In fact, they used to have smallpox.
She knew that she could inoculate him then with the pus from the smallpox.
Well, I don't think she had any idea why it worked, but there wasn't a clear awareness, which careful reading of memoirs demonstrate, that this 15-year-old girl in Padua seemed to know about inoculation. And I find that interesting. And as I say, I would speculate that actually it probably was more common knowledge than people realized in that area. As it happened, I think I uncovered the fact that a couple of medical scholars had written or given papers in Venice about this just prior to the time I'm talking about. So maybe that had also been a reason why people knew about it, and it had sort of infiltrated public understanding and awareness. But I suspect it was more just that information had somehow come across the trade route from the Ottoman Empire, middle part of the 18th century, was recognised, particularly in Britain, as being really useful. And that's partly because of Lady Mary Montague, if I've got that correct, who had been the ambassador's wife in Turkey and had gone to these smallpox parties and realized how useful it was. And she was particularly interested because her brother died of smallpox and she was disfigured by it herself.
Okay.
So when she came back to Britain, because she knew the nobility very well, and particularly the royal family, she was able to persuade them of this. And therefore it gained popularity. Much more so, actually, much more quickly than a lot of Europe did. In fact, Voltaire makes a comment that he was all for inoculation at that time, and he criticised the French for being so slow about it, and thought the British, he was quite an Anglophile actually, but he thought the British were very avant-garde in getting on with inoculation.
It's fascinating, isn't it? You mentioned there about Venice being I guess a particularly interesting place in terms of the development of medicine and maybe the idea of quarantine and that kind of thing. Could you elaborate on that a little bit more about why Venice in particular was a special region?
Yeah. Well, Venice was the lead for public health measures, and was what it did was copied throughout Europe. The first actual sort of quarantine measures was, funny enough, took place in the Republic of Ragusa, Dubrovnik, and that was round about the 1370s because of plague. But it was Venice who then took the lead. And again, it was really important for Venice because they were in the middle of trade routes. They were getting people from all over the world. So they set up things like, well, any vessel that came had to be inspected. The captain was closely questioned about where they had come from, what merchandise they had picked up, whether anyone had been ill on the journey, that kind of thing. And the logbooks were looked at carefully. The Republic actually had 60 guardians whose job it was to do this. And if there were any problems at all, any concern, the merchandise was all fumigated, and people were put into quarantine for about 40 days. So what they did was, because they had built lazarotis, which were sort of the hospitals for people with plague in the past, to be not exactly nursed in, but separated from the rest of the community. What they did was they put people in quarantine in these lazarotis. And in fact, on one occasion, Casanova spent 28 days in the Lazarotti in Ancona. And there was nothing he could do about that. He just had to sit it out and wait, and then eventually be allowed to go home. Incidentally, people had to pay for their bedding and their food whilst they were there. So not dissimilar to quarantine, what we have been doing recently with people coming over here and having to go into quarantine into hotels, airport hotels.
Fascinating. It just all repeats itself, doesn't it?
It does indeed. It does indeed, yeah.
And another thing I wanted to ask you about was you have a chapter in the book about dueling wounds. So Casanova, I don't know much about the duel or why he had it, but Casanova did have a famous duel, didn't he?
Yes, he did, with the Count Branicki, who was one of the most powerful men in Poland, yes.
Was it over a lady friend?
Yes, it was.
Actually, it's not in the dark. Yeah.
It's always a matter of honor, and dueling was always a matter of honor. In fact, dueling was outlawed in many, many places, but this was sort of quite often ignored. And it was outlawed in Warsaw, which is where the duel took place. And so the two men arranged that they were going to have the duel outside the sort of boundaries of Warsaw. In fact, that didn't happen. For some reason, it was within the boundaries. Okay. And so actually, Casanova, they both survived, but they both could have been severely punished for dueling. But the king gave them a pardon. He was very lucky not to be wounded worse than he was. I think the bullet, that was odd too. It was a duel by pistols. Most of his duels were by sword, because he was a good fencer.
Okay.
And Count Renegade was an incredibly good shot. He's a military man, but somehow he lost his nerve. I think it was something to do with a chance comment Casanova made in the carriage, which they took together, saying, "I'm going to shoot your head off." And I think the guy was so concerned about his head being the target rather than his breast, that upset his aim. And so he managed, anyway, he did actually shoot Casanova, but the bullet ricocheted off, I think, a button of his waistcoat. And although he had a superficial naval wound, it then went into his hand. And so he had quite a problem with his hand. I mean, he managed to get some help, first in a monastery, then he was moved to court, and all the sort of cream of Warsaw surgeons came to have a look and suggested he needed the hand amputated because gangrene had set in. But Casanova was more wily than they were, and he was pretty convinced that he hadn't got gangrene. To cut a long story short, and it's a fascinating story, it's very amusing in many ways, and interesting from an ethical point of view, because these Warsaw surgeons, it would appear, really wanted to amputate his arm in order to gain the pleasure, really, of Count Renegade, that they had met, that Renegade could therefore be able to say that Casanova had come off worse than him. And the physicians may have been trying to engineer that. We don't know that for sure, but there's quite good evidence that they were being a bit deceitful at the very least. So Casanova decided to get rid of them. He employed a French physician instead, and the French physician told the surgeons when they came the next morning to amputate to go away. And actually Casanova recovered. It took him about a year, but he did recover his left arm mobility.
Wow. So he had to rely on his wits like over and over again, didn't he, really? And
always.
And somebody in power trying to wipe him out seemed to happen quite a lot as well. Powerful people they either loved him and were benefactors, or they were trying to get him all the time. That seems to be his story, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So another thing that I thought, moving away from the kind of medical side of things, another thing I thought was interesting was on your website you had an essay about you felt that Casanova was a proto-feminist. So what were how did you develop that idea? Because that's obviously, that flies contrary to the opinion that a lot of people have of Casanova as a kind of philanderer. So what made you arrive at the opposite conclusion?
Yeah, well, as you say, I think or imply he's been quite misrepresented. Obviously, it's more appealing to the public to watch a movie maybe about the sexual adventures of a young man than perhaps know the real truth. He wasn't a saint, I will say that. And I will also say that a lot of what he did we would now consider highly reprehensible. But we cannot judge somebody 300 years ago by our current cultural and moral values necessarily. Why I say that, I suppose I think there's so much evidence that he actually respected women. He did his best not to offend his mistresses or make them suffer, especially when the affair ended. He was very, very different to a lot of his contemporaries who were libertines. In that he did not want to use women. The last thing he wanted was a woman to despise him. He wanted, and that probably goes back to his upbringing partly, he wanted them to love him. And in order to do that, he tried to dazzle his women, make them happy, buy them extravagant gifts. He would buy them beautiful clothes, and he was obviously very proud of the fact that when he refurbished the woman's wardrobe, he didn't make one mistake in a single measurement. He regularly spent thousands of pounds, and you know, even when he didn't have the money, he would spend on his loved one. He knew he didn't want to have a lover who was not intelligent and ready to have lively conversations. He loved a curious woman. There's one instant when he buys a young lady a whole sack full of books, a library, and they spend the nights talking about Krevelin and other authors. He knew that he often says, especially later on in life, he'd meet a woman who would say ugly, but her ugliness would disappear, her plainness would disappear if she was intelligent. And he very much bemoaned the fact that women were ill-educated on purpose so that they were good for the marriage market. Okay. There is an amusing incident later on in his life when he wrote a riposte to two Bolognese, I think they were clerics or physicians, who had suggested that a woman with an active uterus had no rationality. So she couldn't reason if her uterus was active. Now, what they meant by that, I don't know, but it could be during menstruation, it could have been when they were pregnant. Okay. And Casanova's riposte is a little text called Lana Capriana, which means goat's wool. And he says this is absolutely rubbish. Women are just as intelligent as men. You could say the same then, that every time that a man's intellect is dominated by his sperm count or something like that. So it's quite a funny little treatise, and it was very popular, and actually earned him quite a lot of money.
It's just amazing, isn't it? It's just that he's so kind of misrepresented over time that it's almost impossible to unpick all the different facets of his character.
I think it bears saying that he was, although he had all these affairs, he was very aware of the problems for women in a very double standard society, that if they got pregnant, they were completely dishonored. So he did practice contraception with a condom, and he did it to protect them. Most men, if you read the literature, especially in Britain, were using condoms to protect themselves from venereal disease. Okay. James Boswell is an example. But he did it mainly for contraception. And then there were various women in his life who were pregnant and came to him for help. These were not women who had been made pregnant by him, but they knew he was reliable and helpful, and he did what he could at considerable cost to himself to help them. Okay.
Well, that's it's been absolutely amazing to talk to you. I'm sure people will want to find out more.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.